Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self-professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with educator and author Jessica Lander about her new book, Making Americans. In it, Lander weaves the present and the past in an analysis of how education for immigrants has evolved and the impacts it has on students today. Jessica Lander is an award-winning teacher, writer, and author. She teaches history and civics to recent immigrant students in a Massachusetts public high school and has won numerous awards for her teaching, including being named a top 50 finalist for the Global Teacher Prize in 2021, presented by the Varkey Foundation, and being named a Massachusetts Teacher of the Year finalist in 2022, presented by the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Jessica writes frequently about education policy and teaching. In addition to Making Americans, Lander is a co-author of Powerful Partnerships, A Teacher's Guide to Engaging Families for Student Success, and the author of Driving Backwards. We held our conversation over Zoom, and so I am inserting my audio quality warning here. I hope you enjoy this historical look at education as much as I did. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is Jessica Lander. She is an educator and author of the recently published book, Making Americans, which will be our focus today. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so let's go ahead and dive into your book. What made you decide to study the history of education for immigrants in the United States?
Great first question. I think to answer that, I have to tell you that first and foremost, I'm a teacher. So I teach recent immigrant and refugee students from about 30 different countries in Lowell, Massachusetts at Lowell High School, which is the big public school in our city. And my just absolutely amazing students come from all over the globe, from Colombia to the Democratic Republic of the Congo to Cambodia. And they do such powerful work in our classrooms, supporting each other, working with each other. And then they also do really powerful work in our communities, being teachers in our communities, being change makers in our communities. And it was through working with them over many, many years that I really got to thinking about how we as teachers, as educators, as school systems can better support our recent arrived immigrant and refugee students as they create new homes and new lives here. And so actually, about 3 years ago, I set out from the classroom, took a year off from the classroom to go travel across the country to learn what others were doing to reimagine immigrant education. And I realized pretty early on that to really reimagine immigrant education, if we were thinking about whole system level change across the country, we would have to have three lenses, three sets of stories to help us rethink what immigrant education could look like. And those were, of course, those innovative present stories of schools across the country working with immigrant students today. They were at the heart of the book, personal stories of my immigrant students now. And so actually sitting down and learning from them about their experience of our schools and their journeys to the US. We have to be learning from our students first and foremost. But also, it was really important to look at the past and to understand the key laws, movements, and cases that have transformed immigrant education over the last 150 years and transformed our schools in ways that maybe we don't necessarily know. I mean, when I set out to dive into this history, a lot of the history I was learning, I'm embarrassed to say, I did not know before starting out on this project and this book. But these are essential stories. They need to be known. And so for me, in thinking about reimagining immigrant education across the country, in addition to looking at the present and learning from the personal, we had to also look at the past. And we had to look at these three together as they interwove with each other.
Yes. And speaking of kind of looking backwards, how has the approach to immigrant education changed throughout the United States?
So immigrant education has been transformed over the past century. And that's transformation has happened through the courageous and persistent work of educators, organizers, families, community members. And I think we're going to talk about a few of those in this conversation. And they stood up to schools in so many different ways. They tackled questions and issues around the segregation of immigrant students, the exclusion of undocumented students, the refusal of school systems to provide language supports for students still mastering English. And it's important to note, too, that progress isn't always linear, that there are examples, one I tell near the end of the book, of how in the 1970s, many schools began embracing multilingualism and multiculturalism. But then in the following decades, we see a backlash to that and a profusion of English-only ordinances and laws across the country, and laws policies that infuse into our schools in really putting preferential treatment to English-only instruction. And it's really only in the last decade have we seen the pendulum swinging back to, again, a celebration and understanding of the many, many strengths of embracing and nurturing multilingualism and multiculturalism. But it has been transforming over the last 150 years, and those transformations have been led by courageous people at all different levels and coming from all parts of our community.
Yeah, and one of the individuals that you talk about is Julia Richmond. So who was she, and how did she influence the development of immigrant education?
Yeah, so Julia Richmond is a really interesting woman. Again, someone I did not know before I started out on this book. There are so many examples of stories that I did not know starting out on this book. And Julia Richmond was a woman living in New York City. She was the daughter of German Jewish immigrants. And she worked at the turn of the century as the first district superintendent who was a woman and also who was Jewish in New York City schools. And she specifically asked to work in the Lower East Side because she wanted to, as she was saying in her writing, she wanted to work with the community in the Lower East Side, which was a lot of recent immigrants and refugees. That was a time of a large number of immigrants coming, particularly from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And she was particularly interesting to me because she was looking at immigrant children coming in and how many of them either didn't attend school or dropped out pretty quickly. And also looking at how the school system worked in treating all immigrant students, sort of clumping them based on their language levels, but not sort of necessarily taking into account their age, and the practices really leading to high dropout rates. And so what she proposed to the superintendent was an experiment. She proposed a series of experiments, but one of them were these steamer classes. And they were named steamer classes in sort of acknowledgement of the steamer ships that brought immigrants to New York City and other major cities at the time, the turn of the century. And these would be 6 months primers for new arrivals, helping with language and culture, with the hopes that it would help ease that transition into general schools in the city. And what's interesting for me is that this was a really novel idea. And it didn't take off in a big way during her lifetime. She actually lived sadly, for not that long. She died as a young woman. But the idea really became a blueprint for an approach that we still see today in either newcomer centers that are transition years, helping to bridge between when you come into this country and learning culture and language, and maybe ways of learning that are different from home country, to helping new immigrants succeed in neighborhood schools, to English learner classes, or some people call them ESL, English as a Second Language classes. But that you see the traces of Julia Richmond's steamer classes in many of the approaches that schools take with immigrant students today, more than 100 years later.
Yeah. And another person that I was very fascinated to see mentioned because, I knew about her. I knew that she was a social activist. I knew that she was involved in many different facets, was Jane Addams. Now, that was a woman that I was not expecting to see as I was reading this book. And so what role did she play in immigrant education?
Yeah, I mean, Jane Addams is, wow, such a fascinating character. And I open her story with just like trying to get at all of the different identities and the power she held as particularly powerful as a woman at the time she was working at the turn of the century. She was deeply, deeply influential and really thoughtful and just spoke across the country as an advocate on so many different issues. I mean, she's the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. But the thing that I focused in on and was really excited about was her work with Hull House, which is a settlement house that she started with other women in one of the poor districts and really immigrant-rich neighborhoods of Chicago, right before the turn of the 1900s. And a settlement house, there are still settlement houses today. There's one in my city as well. Settlement house was a community house that was supporting the community in a whole range of ways. It might be offering language classes to new immigrants, old and young. It might be offering other types of classes, other types of social events, sort of a community hub. It might be offering food supports. In many different ways would advocate for its community. And Jane Addams was responsible with her colleagues in starting Hull House and then also really spreading the idea of settlement houses, which came from England, was brought over to the US. But she's really credited with helping to spread the idea of settlement houses across the country. And what I found particularly interesting was the work she was doing with her immigrant neighbors in Chicago, and specifically to her approach to working with immigrant students. So where in a lot of the country at that time, educators were taking immigrants and trying to forcibly Americanize them into particularly an Anglo-Saxon set of traditions and norms and languages, and really trying to have kids forget their histories and their languages and their cultures to quote unquote be Americanized. And that's what it meant for many educators to Americanize students, is having them forget their language, their history, their culture, and adopt these Anglo-Saxon traditions. What was different about Jane Addams is she really seems to recognize the strengths of immigrant students and immigrant families in a way that I wasn't seeing those strengths recognized by many of their educators I was studying, who were her contemporaries. And so she would talk about how, she has this quote of thinking about immigrant students in the classrooms in Chicago. We send young people to Europe to see Italy, but we don't utilize Italy when it lies about the classroom or the schoolhouse. That we have so many strengths in our classroom with immigrant students from around the world who are bringing their history, their knowledge, their understandings of different political systems. And we are teaching our students about the history of the world, but we're not then tapping those strengths when they're here. And that was really powerful. And it's not to say that she didn't want immigrants to assimilate. And so she's complicated, but she really valued and saw and spoke to others about the importance of seeing and recognizing and valuing the strengths of immigrant students and immigrant families. She creates at Hull House a labor museum, which is a museum to celebrate and honor and teach about the traditions of different crafts from particularly Eastern and Southern Europe, where many of immigrants of that particular neighborhood in Chicago were coming from. And then, of course, it shifted when the immigrant population shifted later in the 1910s, 1920s. And she talks about a story of, well, first, she invited immigrant parents and immigrant adults to come in and teach classes on these different crafts and really seeing them as crafts, these skills that immigrants were bringing. And she tells the story of a little girl who was embarrassed of her mother. And partially it's sort of implied that she's embarrassed because of what she's being taught in school about how she needs to Americanize herself and take off all of the culture and history that she's brought with her. And then one day she sees her mother presenting in the Labor Museum, and it's a shift for her in seeing the value of what her mother is doing and bringing, and that knowledge, and that is valued in the community at Hull House. And she then, as Jane Addams is describing, starts to ask her mother about these traditions and feel that those traditions are important for her to know about. And Jane Addams ends telling the story of how she before tried to avoid like being associated with her mother when she was at Hull House, and now she was walking in the same door with her mom and seeing her mom as someone who had powerful things to teach the community. And so I think just Jane Addams is really important in that way, of someone who more than 100 years ago was really valuing the strengths of immigrants, and particularly immigrant parents and immigrant students. I mean, to the Americanization movement, one of my great-grandfathers came to this country in 1906 as a refugee from what is now Ukraine. And our family is Jewish. And when he arrived, I mean, his history, his language, his religion, his culture were not wanted in most schools. And a lot was then lost because of that, that he stopped speaking Yiddish and he stopped really practicing his faith. And there's a lot of questions that our family has about our history. But my great-grandparents, when they came as refugees, were taught to not be sharing that, to not be bringing that into their adult lives, and really bringing that as central pieces of their identities. And so to think about what's lost, and I think that maybe it makes me really value what Jane Addams was doing in recognizing the strengths of immigrant parents and recognizing the strengths of immigrant students.
Yeah. And so we've touched on Americanization, which I know I wanted to ask you about. So I appreciate you talking about that and kind of how it relates to the curriculum. And also, you know, we talked about individuals, and then we also talked about kind of the institutionalization of education and different laws. And so one of the laws that you talk about is the Simon Act. So what was this, and how did it impact education in America?
Yeah. So in the end of the sort of like at the end of World War I, we see in the country just a huge wave of anti-German sentiment. And then a series of laws and policies around trying to ban all things German, replacing German words with English words. So sauerkraut is liberty cabbage, and German measles are liberty measles. Now we can finally patriotically get sick. Rather absurd. But one of the policies we see too is a profusion of bans on teaching German in school, both in policies, in school policies, and then also laws in states. And about the early 1920s, roughly half the states in the country had such laws, either banning the instruction of specifically German or banning the instruction of languages other than English as a whole, or sometimes banning the speaking of German in public spaces, which included on train cars and speaking on the telephone. And so one of those such laws was a law in Nebraska, the Simon Act in 1919, which said that up until 8th grade, students at any school, public, private, parochial, were forbidden to learn a language other than English during the school day. And violators would and should be expected to get fines and possibly be arrested. I mean, you have a state representative at the time saying, quote, if these people are Americans, let them speak our language. If they don't know it, let them learn it. If they don't like it, let them move. So again, that very rigid sense of what it meant to be American at the time, and that forcible Americanization to an Anglo-Saxon standard of set of traditions, languages, cultures, and history. And of course, interesting here too, because till recently, German was considered part of sort of that tradition that they were encouraging. And now suddenly with the end of World War I, it's suddenly very anti-German. But what this leads to in terms of transformative impact across the country is in 1920, there is a parochial teacher in rural Nebraska in a one-room schoolhouse who has a series of students in front of him. And he is one late May afternoon or midday May afternoon. This is a man named Robert Meyer. So Robert Meyer, May afternoon, 1920, asks one of his students, Raymond Parpart, an 11-year-old boy, to read the Bible in German. And this is during recess. But for doing this, he is fined and arrested, and because of the Simon Act. And he works in, this rural one-room schoolhouse in a community that almost all traces their ancestry back to Germany over the last, we have first-generation immigrants, we have second-generation, third-generation immigrants in this community. Many of them are speaking German in their homes. They're speaking German in their houses of worship. But here he is on that May afternoon being arrested for teaching the Bible in German to Raymond Parpart. And yet Robert Meyer doesn't back down. He holds strong to his conviction, and he takes his case up through the courts, and he loses at the district level and the state level. And then he brings it up to the court. The case rises all the way up to the Supreme Court. In 1923, the Supreme Court comes back in Meyer v. Nebraska in favor of Meyer. And it's a really fascinating legal case that we could get into if you wanted, but has really interesting underpinnings of why the justices side with Meyer. But the outcome is that teachers are allowed to teach and students are allowed to acquire knowledge. And this is a Supreme Court decision that enshrines the right for students to learn languages other than English. And it's a really powerful, it's one of the first cases that's really specifically looking at the education of immigrant origin students in our history. And is, again, an example of, I was talking about earlier, the courageous work of individuals, of this teacher who doesn't back down, and then this impact that he's having nationally. But there are also consequences to the xenophobia and just the present xenophobia over a long period of time, because I end that story. Well, so actually backing up for someone, woven through that story too is that this is happening in the early 1920s. The Supreme Court decision happens in 1923. A year later, though, Congress in DC passes the 1924 Immigration Act, which puts in place quotas, really discriminatory quotas for immigrants coming into the country, which really restricts in a really deep way immigration for the next 40 plus years to this country in a way that favors Northern and Western Europeans and tries to, and succeeds in many ways, excluding immigrants from much of the rest of the world. At the same time, I also wanted to explore the very personal impact of this. And so I had the opportunity to speak to Raymond Parpart's daughter. And so Raymond Parpart was that 11-year-old boy. And she shared with me, she's now in her 80s, and she shared with me how in the 1940s, Robert Meyer was called out of retirement for 1 year. He'd gone on after teaching and then being arrested in the community he was teaching in at the time. He moved to other communities in Nebraska and continued teaching, retired, but he was called out of retirement for 1 year to teach back at the school, that one-room schoolhouse where he was once arrested in 1920. And for that year, he lived on Raymond Parpart's farm with their family. And Raymond's daughter at the time was about the same age Raymond was when his teacher was arrested. And so she was telling me about her memories of Robert Meyer. And two, which was powerful and just also really devastating for me to hear, is she described how she was never taught German. That despite this win and this protection for teaching languages other than English and this way of carrying on traditions and cultures, that she didn't grow up learning German, and that when Robert Meyer was her teacher, because he taught her for that year when he came out of retirement, he also didn't teach German in the classroom anymore.
Hmm. And so you have touched on at least one court case, the Meyer v. Nebraska, but you include an analysis of several court cases throughout the book. And so I'm curious, in your opinion, which court cases had the most lasting impact on education? And for my listeners out there, Jessica's face is like, you want me to pick just a few?
I mean, they're just all so cool. So I would definitely encourage listeners to, hopefully you'll be interested and want to read the book, but I just like these histories are so powerful. And again, they're stories that I did not know. And many of the folks that I talk with don't know these stories. They're not often taught in our schools, so they need to be. So it's wild for me to try to pick one because I think there's so many lessons that we can pull from all of them. But let me tell you a story about one of them. I've talked a little bit about Robert Meyer. Another that's very powerful. I can't say it's the most powerful. I think important lessons from each of them, but one that's just what a story is the story of Mendez v. Westminster. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. And I hope you'll read the book to learn the full story because there's so much in it. So in the early 1940s, the Mendez family have recently leased a farm in Westminster, California, and they are leasing this very fertile asparagus farm. And they go to enroll their children in school. It's actually, they're going to enroll their children in the dad's alma mater. And the Mendez's aunt brings them and her children, and they get to the school, and the school says, well, the cousins, you can stay, but the three Mendez children, you can't enroll here. You have to go a mile away to the segregated Mexican school. Because at the time in California and in much of the Southwest, there were segregated, quote unquote, white and quote unquote Mexican schools. And the Mendezes are furious, as they should be. And they, though, don't back down, and they start to organize, and they start speaking with other families and organizing on the asparagus farm. And they end up hiring a civil rights lawyer out of LA, and they sue the schools for discriminating and segregating their children. And the court case, I dove into just the hundreds of pages of court transcripts, and they are fascinating to read. And they're available online. So people who love history, go dive into them. They're really, really rich. There was a multi-day trial where they had parents and students and educators and school officials, and the ways in which school officials twisted themselves to try to justify discrimination and segregation from, oh, well, they're not Americanized enough, or they don't speak English. And of course, many of these students are American-born, little kids, American-born kiddos. And one of the superintendents, when sort of trapped into a corner by the lawyer, David Marcus, well, they don't know American traditions like Mother Goose rhymes. And for this reason, we have to segregate students. But it's really, they try every single way of justifying discrimination. And after this court case, the court comes back in favor of the Mendezes and goes up to the Ninth Circuit. Also important to note, too, in this case, it's one of the first times that we see, it's not the first, but one of the first times we see social scientists being called in to testify about the impact of segregation on children and what it does. And this will be important in a moment, but it goes up to the Ninth Circuit. And by the time it reaches the Ninth Circuit, organizations across the country have been watching this case, including the NAACP. And so the NAACP writes an amicus brief. Indeed, Thurgood Marshall writes an amicus brief in support of the Mendezes. And the Ninth Circuit comes back in favor of the Mendezes. Now, it doesn't go up to the Supreme Court. It ends there. And 2 months later, the governor of California ends school segregation across the state. Mendezes go back to school. I'll come back to them for a moment because there's another powerful story woven into that. But 6 years later, the governor of California steps down as governor and assumes the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And one of the very first cases he hears is Brown v. Board of Education, argued by, of course, Thurgood Marshall. And in Thurgood Marshall's notes are the notes from the Mendez case, which David Marcus has shared with him. And the NAACP speaks about this, of they were seeing Mendez v. Westminster as a test case for what ultimately became Brown v. Board of Education, which of course desegregates schools across the country. So just talking about impact, wow. But in addition, there are just so many other ways that this story is deeply powerful in weaving together the lives of so many different individual courageous folks. So just two other short stories. And again, there's so much more in this book about the story. But I told you that the Mendezes had arrived recently back in Westminster to lease this asparagus farm. And they were leasing it from the Munametsu family, who had recently been incarcerated during World War II. And the Mendezes would, every couple of months, send and make sure that the Munametsus got the money for the farm, the incarceration camp that they were in the desert. And then sometimes driving out to the camp to get them the money. And then when the Munametsus were released from this incarceration camp at the end of World War II, for a time, the Munametsus and the Mendezes lived together on the farm. I definitely encourage folks to check out Janice Munametsu. Just wrote a book about her family's experience and how it's interwoven with that of the Mendez family, The Kindness of Color. So I hope that you'll check out her work and her book and her family's history. But there's just these powerful interweavings of courageous families and individuals and children too. And then the other story from this book that I'll share just briefly is the story of David Marcus, that civil rights lawyer who is the son of Jewish Eastern European immigrants. And when he was in the courtroom, I mean, my guess is that most of the judges and the judge and the other lawyers, most of the folks in the court would have seen his identity as probably just fully Eastern European, and that was what he was carrying into the courtroom. What they didn't know is that he was married to a Mexican immigrant and that he was raising his 3 daughters to be bilingual. And so this case was deeply personal to him because it's a case that affects his daughters, which the court and those in the court might not have known. And I was talking to one of his daughters for the book, and she shared with me too a story about his own childhood and about his own experiences with schools telling him that he did not belong, that he loved music. And as a kid, he would play the violin. And he told her, his daughter, the story of when he was little and playing the violin at a concert, that he was asked to stand behind a curtain because he was Jewish, so as not to be seen. And another student was asked to stand in front of the curtain and mime the music of playing the violin. And so just these powerful stories of identities of children being taught whether they belong or not belong in our schools, and how those interweave with this bigger history that have transformed schools across the country and have a lasting impact today.
Yeah. And still keeping on the theme of Mexican American and Mexican experiences, included in your narrative is a review of Lyndon B. Johnson's experience in education along the United States and Mexico borderlands. And so for my listeners out there, what was his experience and how did this shape future policy?
Yeah. So LBJ, one of his very first jobs, not his first job, was teaching at one of these segregated Mexican schools on the border, about 60 miles from the border in Cotulla, Texas in 1928. And he taught as an elementary school teacher. And actually, I mean, it speaks of the time. He arrives, he is the only man at the school, so he is instantly made principal. A lot of issues with that. But he teaches for a year as an elementary school teacher at this segregated Mexican school. And he's strict, he's academically demanding, like many of his colleagues, and like many of the educators we've talked about right at the beginning with the Americanization movement. He has little interest in the traditions and cultures of his immigrant origin students, but notably in the interviews of his students, they really found that he cared about them. And you see the ways in which he is advocating for his students in that year of advocating before the local school board to get funding for sports equipment and for different events to run and activities to run at the school for his students. He writes to his mother. I have this letter that the LBJ library shared with me, this letter to his mother asking for 200 tubes of toothpaste for his students. And so what strikes me about him, despite his lack of interest in and his dismissing of culture and language, is his belief that, again, sort of his students have strengths and his students can do powerful things. They can be leaders, whereas many educators that I was reading at the time, his contemporaries, particularly those working in segregated schools, had very low opinions of the futures, the academic futures, the intellectual abilities of their Mexican-American students. And so that makes him really stand out to me. And he then, of course, doesn't actually stay that long as an educator, but he's one of the few presidents we've had who has been a teacher in a public school for a prolonged period of time. We've had a few others who've taught at more private schools or boarding schools for like 6 months, 3 months. But he's one of the few who actually has spent real time as an educator. And then, of course, he goes on to be president in 1963. And he passes in 1965 the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, which now is ESSA, ESEA, which then, of course, in reauthorizations, you might know it as No Child Left Behind, or now the Every Child Succeeds Act. But the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, was the first really major and transformative law at the national level impacting schools across the country. And that really stems from his work, or I believe, and he speaks about this in his speeches, stems from his intimate connections to the classroom. He talks about how when he announces this bill and signs it as president, he believed that no law he had signed or that he would ever sign would mean more to the future of America. And you watch him through his speeches talk about the importance of education again and again and again, and of his own experience of having seen the impact of education or seen the impact of students being denied an education. He stays in touch with his students in Cotulla over many years. He goes back and visits the school, and he has some of his students to the White House. And ESEA is it's a deeply transformative law that we still see the impact today. I mean, it is the key federal law impacting schools. And two, it also, I think, had an impact on another powerful law. I mean, I think it had a number of impacts in many of the laws he passed as part of his Great Society vision. But one of the other ones that strikes me is the 1965 Immigration Act, the Hart-Celler 1965 Immigration Act, which I was telling you about. The 1924 Immigration Act, which instilled the quotas into our immigration system, these really discriminative quotas that really banned most immigrants from much of the country. And the 1965 Immigration Act ends these quotas. And two, I've got to imagine that some of his drive to do that stems possibly from the work he did with immigrant origin students at the border, right at the beginning of his career.
And though we've focused on the historical lens that your book takes, you do contrast, and you touched on it in the beginning of the episode, your book does contrast with kind of this past and present. And so what are you hoping readers will take away from this approach?
Yeah, so, right, as I said in the beginning of our conversation, the book shares stories of the past the present, and the personal. And in each chapter, you have one story of the past, one story of the present, and one story of the personal. And one thing I loved about researching Writing Making Americans is seeing the connections between the past and the present, seeing the ways in which we see Julia Richmond's approach to teaching recent immigrants in the work of newcomer schools today. Like there's a school down in Houston, Texas that I write about that's a newcomer school for kids new to the country less than a year. We see that in the Action Zone, the Aurora Action Zone in Colorado, which is 5 schools that have come together to create a community school approach where they envision the school not as sort of a standalone, separate from the community entity that's open from, say, 7 a.m. and closes at 3 and then sits empty, but really these rich, vibrant community hubs that are open from sunrise to sunset that are collaborating with local hospitals and nonprofits and businesses and groups of immigrant families, and all of them working together in collaboration to support the young people of the community. And I mean, we see the traces of that in, of course, the ideas that Jane Addams was sharing and spreading with Whole House, with the settlement movement, with her focus on the strengths of immigrant families. And so I think it's really powerful when we're thinking about reimagining immigrant education today to be understanding our past and seeing how that past influences and impact our present, and also what ideas it might give us for our future. Mm-hmm. I think it's also a powerful reminder of the role for so many folks in this work. I mean, we've talked about just now the role of teachers, Robert Meyer, the role of families and the Mendezes, the role of lawyers and David Marcus, the role of community members in Jane Addams, and the role of district leaders in Julia Richmond. There's, of course, the role of students. And there's so many other individuals from all different areas. I mean, LBJ, presidents. There's so many examples from this history of the role of different people in the community having a powerful positive impact in creating welcoming and nurturing communities and schools. Yeah. And I think that gives us, or teaches me, a powerful lesson about the role of and the possibility of roles for so many in our community today as we think about creating welcoming, nurturing communities and schools.
And as we begin to wind down, when people are done reading your book and they want to learn more, where should they go?
So many places. There are. So one, I've created a teaching and reading guides that have lots of primary sources to dive into some of the material that I talk about in the book. But I think, too, going to what we were just talking about, the role each of us can play, is research the organizations working in your community to support newcomers, or working in your schools to support newcomers. And what ways can you get involved? Read the words, the voices, the narratives of recent immigrant and refugees to this country. We have so much to learn from them. Talk to your own family about your migration stories, whether those are stories of migration across country borders or across state borders, or maybe even across neighborhoods. Learning those stories of migration, whether those are stories of migration of choice or stories of migration by force. It's powerful to ask these questions. Sometimes we won't have the answers to all of them, but I think it's important to ask the questions. But I definitely say to what we were just talking about is there is an important role for all of us to be involved in the work of creating welcoming and nurturing communities for newcomers, creating new homes and new lives here. And so there are great organizations in communities across the country. And I think research and figure out what those are, and then reach out to them and ask, how can I get involved? How can I help?
Yeah. And where should people go if they want to learn more about you and the work that you do on a daily basis?
So I have a website. It is jessicalander.com. I'm also findable on Instagram, JessicaLander9, and on Twitter, Jessica_Lander. And I would love for folks to reach out to learn more about my work and really also to learn more about my students' work. We haven't had a chance to talk about my absolutely extraordinary students, but they do really phenomenal things in our classroom and in our community. And so I hope you will check out my social media, my website to learn more about the work they do.
Awesome. And I know this is always the hard question for authors because they're always so tied to their work. But having just published Making Americans, do you have any idea about what a next project might be that you'd like to work on?
I do actually. It is connected to the book. So it really comes out of the book. So folks, when you get to chapter 8, you'll notice a difference in how that chapter is set up. So each chapter, as we've talked about over our conversation, follows the format of sharing stories from the past, the present, and the personal. And chapter 8 deviates from this, and it shares stories of the past and also the possible, of thinking about our future, thinking about how we together reimagine immigrant education. And as a teacher, as a public school teacher, I know from my own lived experience that teaching is often very isolating. We have too few opportunities to learn from each other, to share ideas and best practices, to grapple with challenges. And what I found just really exhilarating in having this opportunity to travel across the country and learn from educators and young people and school leaders across the country as I was writing this book is just how many ideas I was jotting down for my own classroom. It was so exhilarating. And I'm so lucky that all these educators generously welcomed me into their classroom. And while I was writing the book, I had like my list of things I was taking for the book. And I had this list of like, oh, I want to try this in my classroom. Ooh, what about this idea? What about that idea? And so all this is to say that I came away wanting to think about how we connect educators more so that they can learn together. And I also found too, that similarly, the educators I talk to across the country have such a hunger to learn from each other. I'd be talking at one school in Georgia, and they'd be doing really powerful work on one aspect of their school and their work with students, but then would be struggling with something else. I'd be like, oh, but I just heard of I saw some really cool practice happening in North Dakota. And can I connect the two of you? And people, educators were so excited to be connected. We don't have enough opportunities for this. So all of this is to say that the work coming out of this book is, for me, thinking about how we create more opportunities for us to learn together. I included in chapter 8 a guide for teachers, policymakers, leaders, school leaders, and district leaders, and also community members of thinking about how we create more welcoming and more nurturing schools and supporting immigrant origin students. And I very intentionally named that guide 1.0 because I know that it will be iterated on and it will expand and it will grow and it will deepen with the wisdom and knowledge and ideas of so many across the country. So the work for me now is trying to help connect folks because while I was able to highlight these 7 schools and they are just really extraordinary, creative, innovative school programs, I know there are also so many more out there that I don't know about yet and that are not known in their community or outside their community, but they have so much to teach us. And so that's the work going forward. It's connected to the book. It's not a new book. This work about how do we go from here about reimagining immigration education and reimagining immigrant education in taking these stories of the past, taking these stories of the personals, taking these stories of the present, and using that together, educators, organizers, community members, researchers, policymakers, all working together to reimagine what schools look like for our students.
Awesome. That sounds like an amazing project. And so finally, as we wrap up here, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like my audience to know?
I think just coming away with that reminder of our immigrant origin students enrich all of our schools and our communities in so many different ways. They bring a wealth of strengths, perspective, knowledge, and skills. And I hope folks will get involved in this work, diving into this history, maybe diving into your own history more in thinking about ways that you can get involved in the organizations in your community to support immigrant origin students and their families. thinking about ways that you can be part of this work of creating inclusive and welcoming schools and communities. But that reminder that our immigrant origin students just bring such tremendous strengths. And I see that every day with my students. They inspire me every day. They inspire me to write this book. And it is such an honor and a privilege to work with them and to learn from them. And they have so much to teach us.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Jessica. And for my listeners out there, if you want to learn about the history of immigrant education or learn about the creativity of today's educators and the students, be sure to pick yourself up a copy of Making Americans today. Thanks again, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me for this conversation.
And there you have it. I had such a wonderful time chatting with Jessica about her book and the history of education in the United States. The book is eye-opening and wonderfully written, and I hope all of you pick yourself up a copy. I have included links to Jessica's book in the show notes for this episode. Thanks again to Jessica for spending her time with me. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.